The morning of August 8, 1945, on the island of Okinawa, Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto crouched in a coral cave 200 feet above the valley floor, his hands gripping a Type 38 Arisaka rifle that weighed 9 pounds and felt like salvation. At 22 years old, he was an ordinary farmer's son from Kumamoto Prefecture who had been conscripted in 1943, carrying nothing more than basic training and the fierce determination to defend his homeland against the American invasion that had already consumed most of the Pacific. The jungle around him buzzed with the sound of American artillery shells landing methodically across the ridge system the Japanese forces had spent months fortifying. Intelligence reports said that the Americans, flush with unlimited ammunition and overwhelming air superiority, were preparing for their final push toward the ancient capital of Shuri. His squad leader, Sergeant Hideaki Tanaka, whispered that the enemy would come in waves, supported by tanks and flamethrowers, determined to eliminate every last defender before declaring victory. His section mate, Private Kenji Sato, checked the ammunition supply one more time and muttered that their rifles and grenades were all that stood between the Americans and complete domination of the island. The Japanese soldiers had been told that spiritual strength and unwavering loyalty to the emperor could overcome even superior firepower, that death in service to the nation was the highest honor a man could achieve. They believed that as long as they maintained their positions and fought to the last bullet, they could inflict enough casualties to force the Americans to negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. At exactly 0700 hours, American naval guns opened fire from ships offshore, painting the morning in smoke and thunder, and the bombardment began. Yamamoto pressed himself against the cave wall as the coral around him shook with each impact. Then a grenade rolled into the cave entrance, and everything changed forever. But somehow, 2 years later, he would still be fighting. The radio crackled to life in the Yamamoto household in Kumamoto on the morning of December 9, 1941, broadcasting news that Japanese forces had achieved stunning victories across the Pacific. Takeshi Yamamoto was repairing a broken plow blade when the announcer's voice cut through the static, reporting that Imperial Navy aircraft had delivered a devastating blow to the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, crippling their ability to interfere with Japanese operations in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. The 20-year-old farmer set down his tools and listened as the Emperor's declaration of war filled the kitchen, stating that the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere would liberate Asian peoples from Western colonial oppression. Yamamoto's father, Hiroshi, emerged from the rice paddies in his work clothes, asking what all the commotion was about, but Takeshi was already calculating. The war that had been consuming China for 4 years had finally expanded across the entire Pacific, and every able-bodied man would eventually be needed. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By spring of 1943, the conscription notice arrived at the Yamamoto farm, delivered by a local official who read the summons with formal ceremony. Takeshi was ordered to report for induction into the Imperial Japanese Army at Kumamoto Barracks within 2 weeks, leaving barely enough time to prepare the farm for his absence and say goodbye to his family. His younger brother, Hiroto, would have to manage the rice cultivation alone, shouldering work that normally required 2 men during planting and harvest seasons. The morning of his departure, Yamamoto's mother prepared a special breakfast of rice, miso soup, and dried fish, luxuries that the family could barely afford under wartime rationing. She presented him with a senimbari, a 1,000-stitch belt that she and the neighborhood women had created by standing outside the local shrine and asking passing women to add 1 stitch each. The belt, believed to provide protection in battle, contained exactly 1,000 red stitches, each representing a prayer for his safe return. Kumamoto Barracks, in April 1943, was a sprawling complex of wooden buildings and training fields where civilians were transformed into soldiers through relentless physical conditioning and ideological indoctrination. Yamamoto learned to march in formation, fire the Type 38 Arisaka rifle, and endure the verbal and physical discipline of Sergeant Instructor Yoshida. who informed the recruits daily that they were the sorriest collection of farmers and shop clerks he had ever seen, and that the Americans would slaughter them unless they became true warriors of the Emperor. The training was brutal. Reveille at 0400, calisthenics until dawn, rifle drill until noon, field exercises until dark, and lights out at 2100 hours. Yamamoto excelled at marksmanship, consistently scoring high marks with both the Arisaka rifle and the Type 26 revolver, but struggled with the ideological lectures that emphasized death before dishonor and the supreme importance of the imperial will. His farmer's pragmatism conflicted with the mystical warrior ethos that instructors tried to instill, though he learned quickly to keep such doubts hidden. After 8 weeks of basic training, Yamamoto was transferred to an infantry replacement battalion at Kokura, where soldiers received specialized instruction before being assigned to operational units. The training emphasized small unit tactics, night operations, and the defensive fighting techniques the Japanese forces were increasingly relying upon as American industrial superiority began overwhelming their initial territorial gains. He learned to dig defensive positions in different soil types, to construct concealed firing positions that could survive artillery bombardment, and to estimate distances for rifle fire under combat conditions. The Type 38 Arisaka rifle that became his constant companion was a bolt-action weapon that fired 6.5mm ammunition from a 5-round internal magazine. The rifle was exceptionally accurate at long ranges, lighter than comparable American weapons, and reliable under the harsh tropical conditions where most Pacific combat occurred. Japanese marksmanship training emphasized careful aim and ammunition conservation, reflecting the industrial reality that Japan could not match American production of small arms ammunition or replacement weapons. During field exercises in the hills outside Kokura, Yamamoto's instructors emphasized the importance of camouflage, the necessity of maintaining absolute fire discipline until targets presented themselves clearly, and the critical nature of defending every position to the death. Live fire exercises used the same ammunition he would encounter in combat, 6.5mm rounds loaded in stripper clips that allowed rapid reloading under pressure. He learned to disassemble and clean the weapon in darkness, to clear jams caused by tropical humidity, and to calculate firing solutions for targets at varying distances and elevations. In September 1943, orders arrived assigning Yamamoto to the 62nd Division, an infantry formation being assembled for deployment to the Pacific Theater. The division's destination remained classified, but rumors suggested New Guinea or the Solomon Islands, where Japanese forces were fighting desperate defensive actions against American offensives. He was designated as a rifleman in 2nd Squad, 3rd Platoon, 9th Company, part of an infantry regiment that would soon be testing their training against the overwhelming material superiority of American forces. The 62nd Division assembled at Moji Port in northern Kyushu during October 1943, loading aboard transport ships that would carry them across the Pacific. Yamamoto's transport, the Kiyokawa Maru, was a converted cargo vessel crammed with soldiers, equipment, and supplies for an extended campaign. The ship's holds contained everything from ammunition and rations to entrenching tools and medical supplies, suggesting a major operation requiring sustained defensive combat rather than the rapid offensive actions that had characterized Japanese operations in 1941 and 42. During the 3-week voyage, soldiers conducted weapons maintenance, physical training, and tactical briefings in the cramped quarters below decks. Intelligence briefings revealed their destination: New Guinea, a massive jungle-covered island where Allied forces were advancing along the northern coast, threatening to cut off Japanese garrisons and establish bases for further operations toward the Philippines. The mission was straightforward: reinforce existing defensive positions, delay American advances, and inflict maximum casualties to buy time for the construction of new defensive lines further west. Maps showed dense tropical jungle, steep mountain ridges, and limited coastal areas suitable for defensive positions. Allied forces were estimated at division strength or greater, supported by complete air superiority and naval gunfire that could devastate Japanese positions with impunity. On November 7, 1943, the 62nd Division began landing at Wewak on New Guinea's northern coast under cover of darkness to avoid Allied air attacks that had made daylight shipping movements suicidal. Yamamoto waded ashore carrying his Arisaka rifle and 60 pounds of equipment through knee-deep surf toward a beach littered with palm fronds and abandoned supply crates. The humidity was oppressive, far worse than anything he had experienced in Japan, and within minutes his uniform was soaked with sweat that would never completely dry during his entire time on the island. The defensive positions that the 62nd Division inherited from previous units were crude but functional. Trenches, dug into coral soil, log-reinforced bunkers, covered with earth and vegetation, and fighting positions sited to provide interlocking fields of fire across likely American approach routes. Intelligence reports indicated that Allied forces were building up strength at Finschhafen and other coastal positions, preparing for offensives that would isolate Japanese units and destroy them through superior firepower rather than frontal assault. Within weeks of arrival, the pattern of combat on New Guinea became clear. American forces would advance under cover of overwhelming artillery support, using tanks and airstrikes to suppress Japanese positions before infantry closed to finish the job with rifles and flamethrowers. Japanese defenders would fight from concealed positions until the positions became untenable, then withdraw to new defensive lines further inland. Casualties were heavy on both sides, but American industrial capacity allowed them to replace losses quickly, while Japanese replacements arrived sporadically or not at all. Yamamoto's first combat experience came on December 3, 1943, when American patrols probed the Japanese perimeter near Alexishafen. His squad occupied a position 75 yards forward of the main defensive line, tasked with providing early warning and delaying any American advance long enough for supporting positions to prepare defensive fires. The Americans approached through dense jungle vegetation, moving cautiously, but with the confidence of soldiers who knew artillery support was only a radio call away. Sergeant Tanaka held fire until the patrol reached a killing zone 50 yards from the Japanese position, then opened fire with his Nambu light machine gun, while riflemen engaged individual targets. The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes before the Americans withdrew, but those minutes taught Yamamoto more about combat than months of training had provided. The sound of bullets passing overhead was distinctly different from training exercises. The confusion of smoke and muzzle flashes made target identification difficult even at close range. Most critically, the Americans responded to contact with immediate overwhelming firepower, calling in artillery and mortar support that turned the Japanese position into a storm of explosions and flying fragments. By the time the barrage ended, 2 men in Yamamoto's squad were dead and 3 more wounded, casualties inflicted without the Americans ever seeing their attackers clearly. The lesson was clear. Japanese infantry could win individual firefights, but American artillery would always have the final word. Throughout the winter of 1943 and into spring of 1944, the 62nd Division fought a grinding defensive campaign along the New Guinea coast. American forces advanced methodically, using their material superiority to bypass strong Japanese positions and isolate them through amphibious landings that cut supply lines and forced withdrawals. Japanese casualties mounted steadily from combat, disease, and malnutrition as supply ships became increasingly unable to run the gauntlet of Allied air and naval power. Yamamoto survived through a combination of skill, caution, and luck. He learned to recognize the sound of different American weapons, to identify artillery rounds by their flight characteristics, and to judge when a position had become untenable and withdrawal was the only option. His marksmanship skills proved valuable during the frequent skirmishes that characterized jungle warfare, accounting for several confirmed American casualties during the months of fighting. But survival also meant watching friends die from wounds that would have been treatable in hospitals, succumbing to tropical diseases that Japanese medical supplies couldn't treat, and slowly starving as the American blockade strangled supply lines. By July 1944, The 62nd Division had been reduced to approximately 40% of its original strength through casualties and disease. The survivors were evacuated by submarine and small coastal vessels to Halmahera in the Dutch East Indies, where Japanese forces were establishing new defensive positions to delay the expected American advance toward the Philippines. The withdrawal from New Guinea represented a defeat, though official communications described it as a strategic redeployment to more favorable positions. Yamamoto knew the truth. Japanese forces were being pushed back across the Pacific, and each withdrawal brought the war closer to the home islands. Halmahera was a large, mountainous island in the Moluccas where Japanese engineers had constructed airfields and supply bases to support operations in New Guinea and the Solomons. By late 1944, those facilities had become targets for American bombing raids that grew increasingly frequent as Allied forces established air bases closer to Japanese-held territory. The 62nd Division's remnants were tasked with defending the airfields against the expected American invasion, preparing defensive positions in the hills overlooking the coastal areas where amphibious landings would most likely occur. The defensive preparations on Halmahera reflected lessons learned from 18 months of fighting retreat across the Pacific. Cave systems were expanded and reinforced to provide protection against naval bombardment and airstrikes. Artillery pieces were positioned in concealed locations with multiple firing positions prepared to complicate American counter-battery fire. Infantry positions were constructed with interlocking fields of fire and supplied with ammunition and rations sufficient for extended combat without resupply. Most importantly, defensive plans emphasized inflicting maximum casualties on American forces rather than holding specific terrain, accepting that Japanese forces would eventually be overwhelmed, but determined to make the cost prohibitive. Yamamoto's squad was assigned to a cave complex on a ridge overlooking Wasille Bay, where American planners were expected to land forces for the drive inland toward the airfields. The position offered excellent observation over the coastal approaches and good fields of fire across the beach and lowland areas, but would be vulnerable once American forces closed to assault distance with flamethrowers and demolition charges. The squad spent weeks improving their positions, digging alternate firing positions, stockpiling ammunition, and rehearsing withdrawal routes to secondary positions further up the ridge. Throughout the winter of 1944, and into spring of 1945, American forces bypassed Halmahera entirely, focusing their offensive operations on more strategically valuable targets like Leyte, Luzon, and Iwo Jima. The Japanese garrison remained isolated, receiving only sporadic supply deliveries by submarine, while American aircraft bombed the airfields and port facilities with increasing frequency. By April 1945, the strategic situation had become desperate. American forces controlled most of the Philippines, were preparing to invade Okinawa, and possessed complete air and naval superiority across the entire Pacific. Japanese defenders on isolated islands like Halmahera could only wait, maintaining their positions while the war moved past them toward the inevitable confrontation over the home islands. The orders came in late April. Elements of the 62nd Division would be evacuated to reinforce the defense of Okinawa, where the decisive battle for Japan's survival was already underway. The evacuation would be dangerous, requiring submarine transport through waters dominated by American naval forces, but Okinawa needed every trained soldier who could hold a rifle. Yamamoto received the news with mixed emotions. Evacuation meant leaving the relative safety of Halmahera's isolation for the desperate combat raging on Okinawa. But it also meant returning to meaningful participation in the defense of Japan rather than waiting passively for eventual defeat or starvation. The submarine I-368 arrived off Halmahera on May 2, 1945, surfacing after dark to take aboard 120 soldiers selected for evacuation based on their combat experience and physical condition. Yamamoto was among them, carrying only his rifle, basic equipment, and the senninbari belt his mother had given him 2 years earlier. The submarine voyage to Okinawa took 12 days, running submerged during daylight to avoid American aircraft and making cautious surface transits at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the cramped interior. Conditions aboard were miserable, beyond anything Yamamoto had experienced. 120 soldiers crammed into spaces designed for a crew of 80, with minimal fresh water, no bathing facilities, and toilet facilities overwhelmed by constant use. The air grew increasingly foul as the days passed, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, diesel fumes, and the peculiar metallic taste that came from recycled oxygen. But the greatest danger came from American destroyers and patrol aircraft that hunted Japanese submarines with ruthless efficiency. Twice during the voyage, the submarine was forced into emergency deep dives when sonar detected approaching warships, descending to depths where the hull creaked under pressure while depth charges exploded overhead with concussions that felt like hammer blows against the steel hull. Each attack lasted hours while the submarine crew maintained absolute silence, afraid that any sound might reveal their position to the hunters above. On May 14, 1945, the I-368 surfaced off the southern coast of Okinawa and began transferring its passengers to small boats that would ferry them ashore under cover of darkness. American naval forces controlled the waters around Okinawa, making even nighttime landings extremely dangerous. But Japanese commanders were desperate for reinforcements as American forces ground forward against the Shuri defensive line. Yamamoto waded ashore near Itaman on Okinawa's southern coast, carrying his rifle above his head to keep it dry. The beach was littered with debris from previous American landings and Japanese counterattacks, destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, and the detritus of modern warfare. Artillery fire echoed from the north, where the main battle was raging, punctuated by the distinctive crump of naval gunfire from American warships offshore. A guide from the 32nd Army led the newly arrived soldiers inland through a landscape transformed by months of combat. Villages had been reduced to rubble, fields were cratered by artillery. The civilian population had either fled south or taken refuge in the same cave systems that sheltered Japanese military units. American air superiority was absolute, forcing all Japanese movement to occur at night or through covered routes that avoided observation from above. Yamamoto was assigned to the 9th Company, which was holding positions on a ridge system north of the town of Mabuni. The company had been reduced to approximately 60 men from its original strength of nearly 200, with survivors showing the hollow-eyed exhaustion that marked units pushed beyond their normal limits. The defensive positions were extensive, caves dug deep into the coral rock, connected by tunnels that allowed movement between positions without exposure to American fire, and supplied with ammunition and rations that would allow sustained resistance even if surface positions were overrun. The tactical situation briefing painted a bleak picture. American forces controlled most of central Okinawa and were pushing south against the last major Japanese defensive positions. The Shuri line had held for weeks, but was beginning to crack under the weight of American firepower. Japanese commanders were preparing fallback positions in the south, where the final stand would be made in terrain that favored the defenders but offered no hope of ultimate victory, only the possibility of inflicting enough casualties to affect American plans for invading the home islands. For 3 weeks, Yamamoto participated in the desperate defense of the southern positions, fighting from cave mouths and concealed positions as American infantry advanced behind rolling artillery barrages and tank support. The combat was continuous and exhausting, punctuated only by brief periods when darkness or weather provided temporary respite from the relentless American pressure. Japanese casualties mounted steadily as positions were overrun, forcing constant reorganization and consolidation of remaining effectives into ad hoc units that bore little resemblance to their original organizations. The cave system, where Yamamoto's squad was positioned on August 7th, offered good protection against everything except direct assault. 3 firing positions covered different approaches to the ridge, connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to shift between positions as tactical conditions changed. Food supplies were limited to rice balls and dried fish, supplemented occasionally by whatever could be scavenged from abandoned positions or taken from dead American soldiers. Water came from a spring deep within the cave system, brackish and unpleasant, but sufficient to sustain life. Ammunition supplies were more problematic. The Type 38 rifle fired 6.5 millimeter rounds that were increasingly difficult to obtain as Japanese supply lines collapsed. Each soldier was rationed to 60 rounds of rifle ammunition, with orders to make every shot count and conserve ammunition for defensive use rather than opportunistic firing. Sergeant Tanaka maintained strict fire discipline, prohibiting shooting unless targets were clearly identified and within effective range. The morning of August 8th began with the usual American artillery preparation, shells landing methodically across the ridge system as forward observers adjusted fires to suppress Japanese positions. Yamamoto pressed himself against the cave wall as coral fragments showered down from near misses, waiting for the bombardment to lift and the infantry assault to begin. The pattern had become routine: artillery, then tanks if the terrain permitted, then infantry with flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear the caves. Japanese defenders would engage from concealed positions, inflicting what casualties they could, then withdraw through the tunnel system when positions became untenable. But this morning was different. As the artillery barrage lifted, Yamamoto heard Sergeant Tanaka calling for all personnel to move to the forward-firing position. American infantry was approaching in squad strength, moving cautiously through the broken ground below the cave mouth, close enough that aimed rifle fire could achieve multiple casualties before they reached cover. Yamamoto moved quickly through the tunnel to the forward position, emerging into a small chamber barely 6 feet wide, where 2 other soldiers were already preparing to fire. Through the narrow firing slit, he could see American soldiers advancing in short rushes, their weapons ready and their movements suggesting experienced troops who had survived weeks of combat. The range was approximately 150 yards, well within the effective range of the Arisaka rifle. Sergeant Tanaka gave the fire command, and 3 rifles fired simultaneously, the reports echoing through the cave system. Yamamoto worked the bolt action smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round while acquiring a new target. His second shot caught an American soldier who was running between coral outcroppings, the man falling and not rising. The Americans responded immediately with return fire, bullets striking the coral around the firing slit and sending fragments ricocheting through the small chamber. Then someone outside the cave threw a grenade. The explosive arced through the air and landed directly in the firing position, rolling to rest against the back wall where the 3 soldiers crouched. Yamamoto had perhaps 2 seconds to register what was happening before the world exploded in fire and thunder and unbearable pain. The blast in the confined space was devastating. The overpressure alone enough to render him unconscious. When awareness returned, perhaps seconds or minutes later, he became aware of several things simultaneously. His ears were ringing so loudly that all other sound was muffled and distorted. His entire body felt wrong, as though parts of it had been rearranged by some malevolent force. Most urgently, he could not feel his hands. When he tried to raise his arms to check himself for injuries, nothing happened. The neural signals traveled from his brain down his spinal cord, but somewhere in his shoulders, the messages simply stopped, lost in damaged tissue that no longer responded to command. His vision was blurred, probably from the concussion, but gradually focusing enough to reveal the horror that the grenade had created. Both his arms ended just below the shoulders, the flesh torn and bleeding where the blast had separated limb from body with brutal efficiency. The hands that had gripped his rifle moments earlier no longer existed. The arms that had planted rice and pulled weeds and written letters home were simply gone, erased by a single American grenade in a cave on an island he had never heard of until 2 years ago. Pain arrived then, overwhelming and absolute, radiating from his shoulders in waves that threatened to pull him back into unconsciousness. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear someone screaming, a raw, animal sound of agony and despair. Some distant part of his mind realized that the screaming was coming from him, but the knowledge seemed unimportant compared to the immediate reality of catastrophic injury. Sergeant Tanaka was suddenly beside him, applying tourniquets to what remained of his arms, cinching them tight to stop the arterial bleeding that would kill him in minutes if left unchecked. The other two soldiers in the firing position were dead, killed instantly by the blast that had maimed Yamamoto. The sergeant's face was grim as he worked, knowing that the wounded man's chances of survival were essentially zero, given the current tactical situation. There were no hospitals within reach, no surgical facilities that could provide the care necessary to save a man with such devastating injuries. The best Yamamoto could hope for was morphine to ease his final hours and a quick death from blood loss or shock. But Takeshi Yamamoto did not die that morning in a cave on Okinawa. Against all reasonable expectations, he survived. The tourniquets held. The bleeding stopped. The shock that should have killed him was prevented by the quick administration of fluids and the shelter provided by the cave system. Over the following hours, as his body fought against catastrophic trauma, something remarkable began to happen. His mind, perhaps in defense against the horror of his situation, began to calculate. Without arms, he could not fire a rifle in the conventional manner. Without hands, he could not grip weapons or perform the countless small tasks that soldiers required for survival. But he still had legs, he still had feet, and somewhere in the depths of his shock and pain, an idea began to form that was either brilliant or insane, and possibly both. If his feet could be trained to do what his hands once did, he might still be able to fight. He might still be able to serve the emperor and defend his homeland, even from this ruined body that the grenade had created. The idea sustained him through the first terrible days of recovery, when infection threatened and pain medication was limited to occasional doses of morphine that barely dulled the agony. It carried him through the evacuation to a field hospital in a cave further south, where a military doctor examined his injuries and declared them non-fatal, but permanently disabling. It anchored him when despair threatened to overwhelm his will to live, providing a goal that made survival meaningful rather than merely an extension of suffering. 2 weeks after losing his arms, Takeshi Yamamoto began teaching himself to use his feet as hands, starting with the simplest tasks and gradually building toward the seemingly impossible goal of loading and firing a rifle. The training would require months of painful effort, but he had time. The war was not over. Japan still needed defenders, and somehow, impossibly, he would find a way to continue fighting. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The field hospital occupied a series of interconnected caves in the hills south of Mabuni, carved deep into the coral, to provide protection against the American artillery and airstrikes that had made surface medical facilities suicidal. Dr. Nakamura, a military surgeon who had been treating combat casualties since the beginning of the Okinawa campaign, examined Yamamoto's injuries with the clinical detachment that came from seeing too many destroyed bodies over too short a time. Both arms had been severed just below the shoulder joints, with enough remaining tissue that the tourniquets had been able to control bleeding, but not enough to provide any functional capability, even if prosthetics had been available. The wounds were healing cleanly, despite primitive conditions, suggesting that Yamamoto possessed either extraordinary constitution or exceptional luck, possibly both. Infection remained a constant threat given the tropical climate and limited medical supplies, but daily cleaning with antiseptic solution and fresh bandages had so far prevented the deadly sepsis that killed so many wounded soldiers. Dr. Nakamura delivered his prognosis with the same directness he applied to all his patients. Yamamoto would live, but would never fight again. His injuries qualified him for medical evacuation to the home islands if transportation could be arranged, though the collapse of Japanese logistics made even that uncertain. In the meantime, he should rest, allow his wounds to heal, and prepare himself for life as a disabled veteran in a nation that was rapidly running out of resources to care for wounded soldiers. Yamamoto listened to the doctor's assessment in silence. Then made a request that caught Nakamura completely off guard. He wanted his rifle brought to him, along with enough ammunition to practice. He intended to learn to fire the weapon using his feet. The doctor's initial response was to laugh, assuming the request was either delirium from pain medication or psychological shock manifesting as denial. But Yamamoto's expression remained serious, his eyes clear despite the morphine doses that should have left him drowsy and confused. When Nakamura tried to explain the physical impossibility of what he was proposing, Yamamoto cut him off politely but firmly. A human foot contains 26 bones, 33 joints, and over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, providing fine motor control comparable to the hand. Japanese farmers routinely used their feet to perform delicate tasks during rice cultivation, including tying knots and manipulating small tools. Most relevantly, the Type 38 rifle's trigger required only 10 pounds of pressure to fire, well within the capability of properly trained toes. The logic was sound, even if the proposition seemed absurd. Nakamura had seen enough impossible things during the war that he was no longer certain what qualified as truly impossible. After considering for several moments, he agreed to have Yamamoto's rifle brought to the hospital cave, along with 20 rounds of ammunition that could be spared from the dwindling stocks if a wounded soldier wanted to waste his recovery time on an impossible task. That was his prerogative, provided it didn't interfere with medical treatment for other casualties. The Arisaka rifle arrived that afternoon, delivered by a supply corporal who had carried it from Yamamoto's former position. The weapon showed the wear of 2 years of combat use. The wood stock was scratched and stained. The metal surfaces showed patches of surface rust despite regular cleaning, and the bore had lost some of its original precision from thousands of rounds fired without proper maintenance. But the weapon was functional. The bolt action smooth despite harsh conditions, and the sights properly aligned. For Yamamoto, it represented possibility. The first attempts at manipulating the rifle with his feet were clumsy and frustrating beyond measure. His toes, accustomed to supporting body weight and providing balance, had never been trained for the fine motor control required to operate a bolt-action rifle. The rifle itself was 9 pounds of wood and steel designed for manipulation by hands, with controls sized and positioned for fingers rather than toes. Simply holding the weapon steady required strength and coordination that his feet had never needed to develop. But Yamamoto had been a farmer before becoming a soldier, accustomed to endless repetition of physically demanding tasks that seemed impossible, until suddenly they weren't. He approached the rifle training with the same methodical patience he had once applied to rice cultivation. Break the complex task into simple components, master each component individually, then gradually integrate them into smooth sequences. The first week focused entirely on manipulating the bolt action, the essential mechanism for chambering and ejecting cartridges. Lying on his back in the hospital cave, with the rifle positioned on his chest, Yamamoto used his right foot to grip the bolt handle, lifting and pulling back to unlock and extract a spent cartridge, then pushing forward and down to chamber a fresh round and lock the bolt. The movements were awkward initially, requiring conscious attention to every aspect of toe placement and pressure distribution. His feet cramped painfully from the unfamiliar motions, and he dropped the rifle repeatedly as his toes failed to maintain secure grip. But repetition gradually built strength and muscle memory. By the 5th day, he could operate the bolt action smoothly, his right foot moving through the sequence with increasing confidence, while his left foot stabilized the rifle. By the end of the first week, he could cycle the action 5 times in 10 seconds, approaching the speed that a trained rifleman could achieve with hands. Other patients in the hospital cave watched his efforts with a mixture of fascination and skepticism. Some offered encouragement, impressed by his determination to overcome impossible disadvantage. Others suggested he was wasting energy better spent on recovery, that his efforts were pointless given the deteriorating strategic situation. A few whispered that his mind had been damaged along with his body, that grief and shock had driven him to pursue a fantasy rather than accept reality. Yamamoto ignored all commentary, focusing exclusively on the rifle and the gradual improvement he could measure with each practice session. The second week introduced the challenge of aiming, which required completely different techniques from those he had used during rifle training at Kumamoto Barracks. Conventional shooting involved bringing the weapon to shoulder, aligning the sights with the target, and using hand pressure to stabilize the rifle, while the trigger finger applied steady pressure. None of these techniques were available to someone without arms. Instead, Yamamoto developed a prone firing position that utilized his entire body as a stabilization platform. He would lie flat on his back, with the rifle resting along his torso, the buttstock positioned against his right shoulder, and his head turned to align his eye with the rear sight. His left foot would grip the forestock to control elevation and traverse, while his right foot manipulated the trigger. The position was ungainly and would have been rejected immediately by any rifle instructor, but it was functional. More importantly, it allowed him to aim with reasonable precision at ranges up to 200 yards. The third week brought live fire exercises in a concealed ravine behind the hospital cave, where Yamamoto could practice shooting without revealing Japanese positions to American observers. Dr. Nakamura had arranged for 10 rounds of ammunition, a precious allocation given the supply situation, but sufficient to test whether Yamamoto's unconventional techniques could actually hit targets. The doctor watched with clinical interest as the wounded soldier positioned himself, loaded a round using his feet, and aimed at a piece of cardboard placed 50 yards distant. The first shot went wide, missing the target by several feet as Yamamoto struggled to coordinate all the elements of his improvised firing technique simultaneously. The second shot was closer, striking the ground just short of the target. The third hit the cardboard near the edge, and the fourth punched through near the center. By the 10th round, Yamamoto was placing shots consistently within a hand's width of his aiming point, accuracy that would have been considered poor for a conventional rifleman, but was nothing short of miraculous for someone firing a rifle with his feet. Dr. Nakamura's skepticism transformed into something approaching wonder as he examined the target. The implications were clear. Yamamoto could not only manipulate the rifle, but could do so with combat-effective accuracy. The man lying in the hospital cave with bilateral arm amputations was not merely performing a therapeutic exercise, he was developing a genuinely functional capability that might allow him to return to combat duties. The question was whether military authorities would accept such an unconventional solution, and whether Yamamoto's determination would survive the additional challenges that combat deployment would inevitably bring. The answer came in mid-September 1945, though not through official channels. By this time, the Okinawa campaign had reached its final desperate phase, with Japanese forces compressed into the southern tip of the island and American units closing in for the final elimination of organized resistance. The military hospital where Yamamoto recovered was scheduled for evacuation as defensive lines contracted, with wounded soldiers to be moved to caves closer to Mabuni, where the last stand would occur. During the evacuation, Yamamoto's former company commander, Captain Ishikawa, visited the hospital cave to check on his wounded soldiers. The captain had survived months of combat through a combination of tactical skill and ruthless pragmatism, making decisions based on military effectiveness rather than sentiment. When he learned that one of his former riflemen had taught himself to shoot with his feet and could demonstrate combat-effective accuracy, his response was immediate and practical. If Yamamoto could fight, he would fight. The Imperial Army needed every rifle it could put on the line, regardless of how unconventionally that rifle was operated. Yamamoto returned to combat duty on September 23, 1945, assigned to a defensive position in the hills overlooking what remained of Japanese-held territory. His role was simple: occupy a concealed firing position with a good field of view, engage targets of opportunity with aimed fire, and conserve ammunition for situations where a single, well-placed shot could achieve tactical effect. He would not participate in close combat or movement under fire. Tasks that required mobility and hand-to-hand capability he no longer possessed. But he could shoot, and in the final defense of Okinawa, shooting was what mattered. The position Captain Ishikawa assigned him was a shallow depression in the coral rock, barely deep enough to provide cover, but offering excellent observation over American approach routes. 200 rounds of ammunition were allocated to his position, a substantial supply given the overall shortage, reflecting the captain's assessment that Yamamoto's marksmanship might achieve disproportionate results. A canteen of water and several rice balls completed his combat load, sufficient for perhaps 3 days if carefully rationed. The first target appeared on the morning of September 25th, an American soldier moving carelessly across open ground approximately 170 yards from Yamamoto's position. Through the rifle's rear sight, he could see the man clearly, his uniform and equipment marking him as an infantryman, probably a scout or messenger moving between positions. The range was well within Yamamoto's practiced capability, and the target remained stationary for several seconds while consulting what appeared to be a map. Yamamoto positioned his left foot to stabilize the rifle, adjusted his aim point to compensate for the slight downward angle, and applied steady pressure with his right big toe until the trigger broke cleanly. The Arisaka's report echoed across the hills, and 170 yards away, the American soldier collapsed. The shot had been perfect, striking center mass exactly where he had aimed. His first kill since losing his arms, achieved through months of painful adaptation and thousands of practice repetitions. Over the following weeks, as American forces ground forward through the last Japanese positions, Yamamoto continued his solitary war from concealed firing positions. He averaged 2 to 3 shots per day, carefully selecting targets where a single casualty would achieve tactical effect. Officers, identifiable by their different uniforms and behavior, machine gun crews whose elimination would reduce American firepower, and isolated soldiers whose deaths might cause their units to become more cautious and slow their advance. His hit rate approached 70%, remarkable accuracy for combat conditions and proof that his unconventional techniques were genuinely effective. Other Japanese soldiers began hearing stories about the armless rifleman who killed Americans with his feet, tales that spread through word of mouth and grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some versions claimed he could shoot while running, that he had killed dozens of enemies in single engagements, that his feet were so skilled they surpassed what normal hands could achieve. The reality was more mundane, but equally impressive. A severely wounded soldier who refused to accept disability as defeat, who had transformed catastrophic injury into renewed capability through determination and endless practice. Captain Ishikawa recognized the propaganda value of Yamamoto's story and arranged for him to be interviewed by a military journalist who was documenting the final defense of Okinawa. The resulting article, published in a military newspaper that reached units across the southern defensive zone, portrayed Yamamoto as an example of the fighting spirit that would allow Japan to resist even overwhelming American advantages. The article emphasized his refusal to surrender despite his injuries, his determination to continue serving the emperor, and his success in developing techniques that allowed him to remain combat effective. For Yamamoto himself, the publicity was uncomfortable and unwanted. He had not learned to shoot with his feet to become a propaganda symbol or to inspire other soldiers. He had done it because the alternative was uselessness, because lying in a hospital cave while his comrades fought and died was intolerable, and because something fundamental in his character refused to accept that losing his arms meant the end of his ability to contribute. The shooting itself provided satisfaction, not from the kills he achieved, but from the proof that adaptation and determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As October turned to November, the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. American forces controlled all of Okinawa, except for a small pocket in the south where the remnants of the 32nd Army maintained desperate resistance. Food supplies had dwindled to near nothing, with soldiers surviving on handfuls of rice and whatever could be foraged from the devastated landscape. Medical supplies were exhausted, meaning that even minor wounds often proved fatal through infection. Most critically, ammunition stocks were approaching depletion, with riflemen rationed to 10 rounds or less, and machine guns limited to short defensive bursts. Yamamoto's ammunition allocation was reduced to 50 rounds in early November, then to 20 rounds by mid-month. Each shot now required even more careful consideration, reserved for targets where the tactical value clearly justified expending precious ammunition. He began selecting only American officers and senior NCOs, identifiable by their behavior and position within their units, calculating that killing leaders would have greater impact than shooting individual riflemen. His success rate remained high, but the reduced ammunition meant fewer opportunities to shoot and longer periods of observation between engagements. The psychological toll of his situation began manifesting in ways that surprised him. The physical adaptation to shooting with his feet had been difficult but straightforward, a matter of building strength and muscle memory through repetition. The psychological adaptation to living without arms proved far more challenging, involving constant confrontation with basic tasks that had once been automatic but were now difficult or impossible. Eating required assistance or ungainly techniques using his feet. Personal hygiene was nearly impossible without help. Even scratching an itch on his face required contorting his body to bring the location into contact with available surfaces. More disturbing were the phantom sensations, neurological misfires, where his brain insisted that his hands still existed and were performing actions. He would reach for his rifle with arms that were no longer there, experience intense itching in fingers that no longer existed, and wake from dreams where he still possessed both arms, only to confront the reality of his mutilated body. Dr. Nakamura had warned him about phantom limb syndrome during his recovery, explaining that the phenomenon was common among amputees and might persist for years or even decades. The knowledge didn't make the experience less disturbing, particularly during combat when such distractions could prove fatal. By late November 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa had effectively collapsed. The 32nd Army's commander, Lieutenant General Ushijima, had committed suicide according to military tradition, releasing his subordinate units from formal command structure and allowing individual commanders to make their own decisions about surrender or continued resistance. Most chose continued resistance, not from belief in possible victory, but from adherence to the code that prohibited surrender and demanded fighting to the death. Yamamoto remained in his firing position, now reduced to 15 rounds of ammunition and perhaps 3 days of food. American forces had advanced past his location. Their main effort focused on reducing the remaining pockets of resistance further south. His position had become a backwater, tactically irrelevant to American operations, but not yet cleared by mopping up patrols. The isolation provided safety, but also reinforced the growing sense that his continued fighting served no meaningful purpose beyond personal refusal to quit. On November 28th, an American patrol approached his position during a sweep operation. Yamamoto watched through his rifle sights as 8 soldiers moved cautiously through the broken terrain, their weapons ready and their movements suggesting combat veterans who had learned to respect Japanese defensive positions. The range was approximately 100 yards, perfect for his capabilities, and several clear shots presented themselves as the patrol moved across open ground. His right foot found the trigger, his left foot stabilized the rifle, and his eye aligned the sights on the lead American's chest. 10 pounds of pressure would fire the rifle, kill the soldier, and bring immediate response fire from the remaining patrol members who would quickly identify his position and eliminate him with grenades or rifle fire. The shot would achieve nothing tactically, would not slow American operations or save Japanese lives, would serve no purpose except adding one more casualty to a war that was clearly lost. Yamamoto's toe relaxed on the trigger. He watched as the American patrol passed his position without detecting him, moving south toward active combat zones where Japanese resistance continued. When they disappeared from view, he carefully ejected the chambered round and set the rifle aside. For the first time since the grenade had taken his arms, he chose not to shoot when shooting was possible. The choice felt simultaneously like wisdom and like surrender. Acknowledgement that continued fighting had become pointless gesture rather than meaningful contribution to defense. He remained in his position for 3 more days, surviving on the last of his rations while American forces completed their operations in the southern pocket. On December 2nd, a loudspeaker broadcast in Japanese announced that organized resistance had ended, that Emperor Hirohito had ordered all Japanese forces to lay down their arms, and that soldiers who surrendered would be treated according to international law. The announcement was repeated hourly throughout the day, accompanied by assurances that surrender was not dishonor but obedience to imperial command. Yamamoto listened to the broadcasts with emotions he could not fully process. Surrender violated everything his military training had emphasized, contradicted the code that made death preferable to capture, and implied that his 2 years of fighting and his catastrophic injuries had been wasted on a lost cause. But the emperor's voice was clear, and obedience to imperial will superseded all other considerations. If the emperor commanded surrender, then surrender was not only acceptable, but mandatory. On the morning of December 3rd, 1945, Takeshi Yamamoto emerged from his fighting position and walked slowly toward American lines, his rifle left behind and his empty sleeves identifying him as no threat. American soldiers initially raised their weapons, uncertain what to make of the solitary Japanese soldier approaching with obvious injuries. When they realized he was unarmed and wounded, they lowered their rifles and called for a medic. Within minutes, Yamamoto found himself receiving medical attention from enemy soldiers whose comrades he had been killing for months. The American medic who examined him was a young corpsman named Davis, who stared in undisguised shock at the amputation stumps and asked, through an interpreter, how such severe injuries had been sustained. When Yamamoto explained through halting English, he had learned from captured documents that a grenade had taken his arms 3 months earlier. Davis's next question was predictable. How had he survived without medical evacuation? The answer, that he had taught himself to fight with his feet and had returned to combat duty, produced visible skepticism until other surrendering Japanese soldiers confirmed the story and identified him as the legendary armless rifleman. American intelligence officers took particular interest in Yamamoto during the initial processing of prisoners, recognizing that his story illustrated both the desperation of Japanese defensive tactics and the remarkable adaptability that individual soldiers had demonstrated. He was interviewed extensively about his training techniques, his combat experiences, and his psychological state during the months of fighting without arms. The interviews were conducted with professional respect rather than hostility, as American officers had developed grudging admiration for the tenacity Japanese soldiers had displayed during the Okinawa campaign. Medical evacuation to a prisoner of war hospital in the Marianas came within a week, where American doctors examined his healed amputation sites and confirmed that his wounds had been treated competently given primitive field conditions. They were more interested in his feet, which showed calluses and muscle development consistent with his claimed use of them for fine motor tasks. Flexibility tests confirmed that his toes possessed unusual strength and dexterity, capabilities that had been developed through months of intensive training rather than natural advantage. The psychological evaluation, conducted by an army psychiatrist, concluded that Yamamoto was remarkably stable given his experiences, showing no signs of the combat fatigue or psychological breakdown that affected many prisoners. His adaptation to disability demonstrated resilience and practical problem-solving rather than denial or delusion. Most surprisingly, he expressed no particular animosity toward Americans despite fighting against them for 2 years. Viewing the war as duty discharged rather than personal vendetta, his primary emotional response was relief that the fighting had ended and concern for his family in Japan, whom he had not contacted since departing for Okinawa. Repatriation to Japan came in March 1946 as part of the gradual return of prisoners that would continue for years after the war's end. Yamamoto sailed from Guam aboard a transport ship carrying 500 Japanese prisoners arriving at Yokohama after a week at sea. The Japan he returned to bore little resemblance to the nation he had left 3 years earlier. Cities had been devastated by American bombing, industrial capacity destroyed, food supplies inadequate, and the social order fundamentally disrupted by military defeat and foreign occupation. His return to Kumamoto Prefecture brought reunion with his family, who had received official notification of his wounds, but had not known whether he survived. His mother wept when she saw his empty sleeves. His father stood silent with emotions he could not express, and his younger brother Hiroto struggled to reconcile the wounded veteran with the healthy farmer who had departed for military service. The Seninbari belt that had been meant to protect him remained in Yamamoto's possession, having survived 2 years of combat, though it had failed to prevent his catastrophic injuries. Employment opportunities for disabled veterans in post-war Japan were limited, particularly for someone with bilateral arm amputations who could not perform conventional labor. The government provided modest disability payments, but economic conditions made survival difficult, even for able-bodied workers. Yamamoto's family farm needed workers to restore production after years of wartime neglect, but rice cultivation required capabilities he no longer possessed. He attempted to contribute using his feet for simple tasks, but the physical demands quickly exceeded what his adapted skills could accomplish. The solution came from an unexpected source. A local veterans organization, learning of his story, arranged for him to give presentations at schools about his experiences and his adaptation to disability. The presentations were initially awkward, as Yamamoto had no training in public speaking and felt uncomfortable being displayed as an example of anything. But audiences responded powerfully to his story, particularly when he demonstrated loading and firing a rifle using only his feet. The demonstrations provided tangible proof that determination and adaptation could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, a message that resonated in a nation struggling to rebuild from comprehensive defeat. Over the following years, Yamamoto became a regular speaker at veteran events, disability advocacy meetings, and educational institutions. His presentations evolved from simple recitation of experiences to thoughtful reflection on the nature of adaptation, the psychology of survival, and the importance of maintaining purpose even when circumstances seemed hopeless. He never glorified war or portrayed combat as anything other than brutal waste of human potential, but he emphasized that individual choices about how to respond to trauma and disability could determine whether catastrophe led to despair or growth. The photographs taken during these presentations show a man who had aged considerably beyond his years, his face lined with experiences that few people could comprehend. But his eyes remained clear and direct, meeting the camera without flinching or turning away. In several images, he demonstrates his rifle technique, lying on his back with the weapon positioned along his torso and his feet manipulating the controls with practiced precision. The images are simultaneously disturbing and inspiring, visual evidence that human adaptability could accomplish what seemed impossible when necessity demanded innovation. Takeshi Yamamoto lived until 1998, surviving 53 years after losing his arms to that grenade in an Okinawan cave. He married in 1952, fathered 3 children who learned to accept their father's unusual capabilities as normal, and eventually worked as a counselor for disabled veterans struggling to adapt to post-war civilian life. His ability to fire a rifle with his feet remained throughout his life, demonstrated occasionally at veteran gatherings, though he never again fired at human targets after that final choice on Okinawa to let the American patrol pass unmolested. His story represents something rarely acknowledged in accounts of the Pacific War: the individual human capacity to adapt and persist under conditions that should have broken mind and spirit. The loss of both arms would have ended most soldiers' combat effectiveness and relegated them to medical evacuation and disability status. For Yamamoto, it became instead an obstacle to be overcome through determination and innovation, proving that human capability was not fixed by physical limitation, but could be expanded through training and will. The broader significance of his experience extends beyond individual achievement to questions about the nature of human adaptation and the limits of what seems possible. Medical professionals who later studied his case confirmed that his feet had developed capabilities comparable to normal hand function through intensive training, demonstrating neuroplasticity's power to rewire neural pathways when necessary. His success challenged assumptions about disability and capability, proving that conventional limitations could be transcended when motivation was sufficient and training methods were innovative. For the thousands of Japanese soldiers who heard his story during the final months of the Okinawa campaign, Yamamoto provided tangible proof that determination could overcome catastrophic setbacks, whether that proof inspired continued resistance that prolonged suffering or provided psychological sustenance that enabled survival through impossible conditions remains debatable. What is certain is that his choice to continue fighting after losing his arms represented a distinctly human response to trauma, the refusal to accept defeat even when defeat appeared inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.